All right, good morning. Welcome to our webinar today. Thanks everybody for joining us. For those on the West Coast, 8 a.m., so a little bit of an early start to our webinar from our normal schedule. A couple housekeeping items that I wanted to cover. We're going to be recording this, so we'll be able to send out a copy to you afterwards. We'll also have copies of the slides that you can then share internally with colleagues and all, or other folks that have missed it. You can give them your link to the recording. So don't worry, we'll follow up and make sure you get copies of both the recording and the slides to this. The other housekeeping item I want to mention is we've got some time for Q&A at the end. You can submit your questions through the chat, and I'll try to answer them at the end. If I don't get to them, we can follow up via email if I can provide either a resource for you or an answer to your question. So submit the questions at any time. That's really helpful. That way there's a bunch of them queued up for the end so people aren't waiting to get their questions in when we get to the end. Today's webinar, we're going to be talking about top EHS risks and compliance trends to watch in 2021. There's a lot to watch out there, so I've tried to distill it down to a couple main categories, focusing on some big picture issues, and then one in particular on a little bit deeper of a technical issue to pay attention to. But there's a lot of directions you can go, especially when you look at it from an EHS side, not just the environmental side, but the health and safety also. I'm going to touch on both of those areas, but with a little bit more of a focus on the environmental side today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ryan Jenick. I'm one of the co-founders of Mapistry. I'm the COO here. Come from the civil engineering world. I'm a former Bay Area Air District Hearing Board member and spent a bunch of time working on stormwater issues at the federal and local levels prior to founding Mapistry. So my focus tends to be on the environmental compliance side, but as you see, we'll touch on some of the health and safety, especially on COVID today. A little bit of background on Mapistry. I know the attendee group here there's a lot of our customers. Thank you for joining. Really appreciate you guys coming out and kind of listening to what's coming in 2021. Mapistry is a software company. We're really on a mission to give you control of your environmental program by automating, digitizing all the kind of routine compliance parts of an EHS or environmental program to give EHS teams the ability to focus on the more strategic aspects and operations, to focus on the production and execution parts. So we really want to automate a lot of the routine compliance pieces around environmental programs. And what that does is it gives you not only a resilient system, and as you're going to see, and you're probably experiencing a lot with COVID and the rapid pace of regulatory change and enforcement actions, et cetera, to have that resiliency in your program, whether a plant manager changes over, whether you have new EHS initiatives, whether you have personnel at a corporate level changing over, having that ability to collaborate and automate as much of the program so that you can focus on those other aspects of either production operations or EHS strategy, planning, engineering. So before we dive too far into 2021 and what we're looking at and what we're tracking from an EHS risks and trends standpoint, let's look back at 2020. So on January 21st, almost a year ago, we had a webinar very similar to this, and we looked ahead for what's coming in 2020, what's on the roadmap. So COVID, we never saw it coming. It wasn't a topic in mid to late January of 2020 for any of us really focusing. It should have been, in hindsight, looking back at it, we should have been a little bit more aware of it, but we didn't see this coming and the impact it would have on us over the past year. But the three main issues we looked at in the beginning of 2020 were increased local and state influences on regulatory enforcement, really driven by the messaging around the Trump administration, regulatory rollbacks, and a big pushback at the state and local level to counteract that, whether that's a PR battle or actuality. But we saw that, we predicted a big pushback on that. We have seen that play out. We have seen federal level enforcement over 2020, even from like EPA regional offices doing coordinated requests for information or records. We've seen that. So increased local and state influences was one of the big issues. The other one was public participation, so looking at open data initiatives, and we're going to touch on that again today. And then emerging technologies. And here's just a couple of the slides from last time, is that at a national level in the beginning of 2020, we were looking at EPA focusing on significant non-compliance. So it was National Compliance Initiative. You'll see how this plays out for 2021. But the focus in 2020 was really around compliance, getting companies in compliance, reducing the number of significant non-compliance. The same thing we looked at a local level is, in California, there was a big push for business license to require, in order to get your renewed business license, you needed to file your stormwater permit or have an exemption from it. We saw that play out in California over 2020, pushing a number of businesses to have to file or get stormwater permits, or at least file for exemptions based on their SIC code. We anticipate this will continue in 2021, not only in California, but as other states and localities look to adopt similar regulations, they will push companies to comply with certain environmental regs and tie that to some other business license to force compliance around it. The other thing we showed was this graph, and this will come up later in the webinar, showing how it's changed since 2020 to 2021. As you can see, around 10,000 page views of EPA data sites. And if you'll notice on the left is about when the administration changed from Obama to Trump. So we're seeing like a 5x growth over the Trump administration in open data and public access to EPA data. And then the final one, the emerging technologies. Now, I have to say this one didn't play out in 2020 as much as I had anticipated. I thought there would be a much bigger trend to using drones, using remote sensing. I still think this is a developing area. I thought it would really explode in 2020. I didn't see that play out as much, but it was one thing we identified a year ago as an issue to watch over the coming year. So that's a quick snapshot of like what we said a year ago of 3 really big issues to watch. In coming into 2021, some of those are carryovers. Some of those I still think are really important to watch and pay attention to as we look forward for the next year. And then added in some new ones. So one is the COVID impact. What has that done with work from home? What has it done for enforcement at a regulatory level around record keeping and general duty clause? I mean, the COVID impact is still going to be, it was a major issue in 2020. I think it'll continue to have a huge impact in 2021. The other thing we're tracking is enforcement increase with the change in administration from Trump to Biden. There's a couple of things that we're going to carefully track, and for companies out there, I almost think this is going to be the biggest factor in the next 12 months on your EHS operations. As this administration changes, we'll go into more details, just because it's going to have a huge trickle-down effect, and I think it's going to be very fast, and they're probably going to hit pretty hard right out of the gates in that first 100 days. The other thing tracking is a carryover from 2020, really electronic data impact. So enforcement initiatives tied to data, public data sets, and then even looking more, as we see over the past couple of years, is investors, SEC getting involved in ESG initiatives, and what is that going to force from a data reporting standpoint and a more like public insights into companies' data and how they're doing. And then the final thing, and this is a more kind of in the weeds technical thing, is just looking at PFAS and some of the stuff that's been done at the federal level and what we're seeing and why it's one of those emerging issues that I really focus on from a technical side in 2021. So 4 major initiatives we're going to talk about today, looking at kind of risks and trends, and then a couple of things to think about that we're excited about, of like, how do you counteract this? Obviously, we're a software company, so one of our big beliefs is that we can use software to mitigate the risk of a lot of these items on here. But we're going to dive into each of these 4 a little bit more today. We can go a lot deeper in any of these issues, so feel free to follow up with us or anybody on our team if you've got more questions about some of these specifics. And just so that when you're sharing this, I know these often get shared internally and as a source of discussion, as a source of budgetary initiatives. I've put resources, the links to a lot of these, so you can look at the references and sources as a follow-up to this webinar. So issue number 1, really looking at the impact of COVID in 2021. This is an example from the ready-mix concrete industry, looking at ticketless truck dispatch. COVID really drove technology in all facets of operations, and EHS is just one of them. One of the things we've seen as a software company is far faster adoption of our own software system or other software systems to run EHS programs. But this COVID impact has driven it across the board. Work from home has driven a lot of these technologies and these tools to be adopted in industries that many of you are in that had not adopted as much technology as maybe say some others like tech companies. So that remote work really drove adoption. We're seeing that play out in 2021. The other thing is on the flip side is from a regulatory agency, everybody went to work from home. They're out of the office. They're doing virtual site visits, and I think one of the big things that the agencies have realized is this: a virtual site visit can have the same impact as an on-site site visit, but it takes a fraction of the time. And what we've seen is agencies being more and more fluid with these. They've gotten used to doing them. And what they'll do is they'll send out requests for documents ahead of time, say, send me 5 years worth of inspection records, send me the latest version of your stormwater plan or your SPCC plan. And then they'll have time to look through it, and then they'll do a virtual site visit afterwards. And they'll even have somebody walk around the site with a camera or video. And they'll stop them at certain points and say, can you walk over there? I want to look at that piece of equipment, that pollution control device. I think this, and they can do it all remotely, so they can do more of these. So we're going to see a impact from COVID really forcing this. But what it's caught on from a regulatory standpoint is they're able to do more of these with even the same amount of staff or less staff. So it's really expanded their impact on regulated entities. So one of the things is really be prepared for maybe more site visits, but more of the virtual kind than the in-person kind over the next year and even into the coming years. So this goes back to one, making sure folks have their records. The fact that records are digitally makes it a lot easier that you can download a bunch of PDFs and send it to somebody rather than taking that binder or having to go out to a plant, grab that binder, come back to the office, scan it in, then send it to an agency. We see a lot more confidence from inspectors when they get records digitally very quickly. It shows that there's a healthy program, there's stuff being tracked, rather than saying I need weeks of time and scrambling to try to find those other forms. So pay attention from a regulatory standpoint. We're going to see more and more virtual site inspections, virtual visits, as a way to increase the number of these inspections. And I don't anticipate this changing even if we kind of return back to the office, return back to pre-COVID days. I think agencies have really seen this as a way to supplement and expand the existing staff they have. And this will play in at a federal level too, with a revitalization of Obama era next generation compliance tools and technologies that we'll talk about, but we're seeing it on the local level too. The other thing is COVID impact is just on a compliance. One of the things OSHA put out is most common violations around COVID. There's a resource at the bottom, there's a citations guidance. So if you want to take a look at it, a lot of them are on respirators, respirator fit testing, et cetera. But general duty clause is one of the ones that they cited that I want to point out is, people not looking at industry specific guidance, not doing record keeping, those type of things is something that is going to be a focus area as, COVID continues. The other thing is one of the Biden administration's COVID initiatives is to double the number of OSHA inspectors. I have a feeling they will focus heavily on COVID just because it's a hot topic right now. They're going to put out some kind of templates around what they expect from a COVID standpoint related to workplace safety. But if this goes through, it's like double the number of OSHA investigators combined with this, the virtual inspection site visits that I talked about. Those two things could have a really big impact on all of you because with 2x the number of investigators, and if you're able to do 2 or 3 or 4 times the number of virtual site visits as you are able to do in-person visits, this really expands the amount of focus on companies around not just COVID, but other health and safety areas. So something to really track and something that, a year from now as we look back to see if this actually got implemented and what the impact was to companies around the US. So the other kind of lingering question, and it's something we're tracking, and as we look at 2021 in terms of risks and trends, it's more just a question out there is, will we see the monetary side catch up with the focus on COVID? If we double the number of OSHA inspectors, will we see the fines go up? What will happen at a state level? You can see, LA Times talking about California, where it's been focused mainly on COVID education versus like enforcement and monetary penalties. A couple others, Maine, Connecticut, most states are enacting some sort of financial penalties for businesses. It seems pretty common. It's about a $10,000 fine, for violating different COVID ordinances that can range from, requiring the use of masks to actually worker safety plans, record keeping, those type of things. So this is something we're tracking. We haven't really seen it play out to the extent, but as I said, when we kicked this off, COVID was something we didn't really anticipate a year ago, and I anticipate this will start ticking up, especially as we get into 2021. So that's from a health and safety side, really looking at the COVID impact. I think two major things there, driving the digital collaborations, work from home, remote virtual inspections, and then also just enforcement around COVID related issues, especially for OSHA and at a local, state and local level for health departments and health and safety departments. The other thing to look at is just enforcement initiatives overall. We'll look back on 2020 penalties from EPA, 160 million, 2019 had 478 million. So we're seeing a big decrease. I believe one of the big differences, one of these big penalties was related to auto manufacturers. I think about a $300 million fine for VW is likely making this big jump. One of the things that came out with the study from this University of Michigan law professor is, looking at Clean Water Act prosecutions, Clean Air Act prosecutions. Trump administration really had a big shift from national, enforcement initiatives, NEIs, to national compliance initiatives. So it's really around compliance, less on enforcement. So looking back in the 2020, and then you see the COVID temporary suspension of enforcement policy. In practice, I don't think this played out as much as what was talked about in the media. We still saw quite a bit of enforcement at a local level, even with many states echoing this policy. Even in states that have very aggressive enforcement strategies, they echoed the federal EPA policy on temporary enforcement. And they still enforced all through COVID. So I don't think that had as big of an impact across the country. I think it was more just the general framework of the administration moving from enforcement initiatives to compliance initiatives that really drove this down. I think what you will see is a rapid reaction back in the other direction in 2021. I think there's a lot of pressure to make this, from a PR and a messaging standpoint, flip around with the Biden administration coming into office. One of the things GreenBiz put out there, in the first 100 days is the Biden administration will be forced to really push out to the citizens all these environmental initiatives that they enacted in the midterm elections, and that's only 2 years away. So you're going to see a very rapid push for enforcement. I think, informally, what I've heard from companies and from industry trade groups is a lot of focus of be prepared for rapid enforcement action at the federal level due to this administration change. The other big concern to pay attention to is anybody out there with brand name companies. Big splashy headlines around that is a quick win, even if it's not, if it's less on the quantity but high on from a PR side, the quality side. I could see that. So anybody with brand name companies are definitely high on the target list for making a splash for an administration change that is really going to push towards enforcement over compliance. The other thing that we want to look at is who's being appointed at a federal level. This is going to drive strategy at a federal level, and then there'll be some trickle-down impact. So a couple of things that is maybe unique is Merrick Garland is, the nominee for Attorney General, and brings a lot of environmental background. And this is notable because one of Biden administration's big initiatives is a new division in DOJ around environmental and climate justice. This is on top of the DOJ's already environmental and natural resource division. So you may get two DOJ divisions focused on environmental issues and enforcement, led by, if he's confirmed, Merrick Garland as a really focused on environmental. So you get DOJ getting much more involved than maybe any administration in the past, potentially, given the Biden administration's focus on environmental and environmental justice, plus the leadership there. One of the things that's still tracking is who is going to be the Assistant Attorney General for that specific division, and whatever happens with the Environmental and Climate Justice Division, does that get formed and who leads that? But you could see a lot of enforcement action coming out of the DOJ. There's also going to be a big focus with cross collaboration. Michael Reagan is the EPA administrator nominee, comes from North Carolina, as you'll see with the PFAS issues, his experience there. But you'll see a lot of collaboration between EPA and DOJ, I would anticipate in 2021. I also, on the EPA side, EPA Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, there was a big shift from enforcement to compliance. I anticipate in 2021 that to reverse, and EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance to be more on the enforcement side than the compliance side for going outwardly towards companies. So tracking who are the leaders of DOJ and EPA, and right now it looks like there's going to be a pretty heavy focus from DOJ on environmental, especially if that new division's formed and Environmental Natural Resource Division really expands the scope. It could be quite a bit of focus from the DOJ and EPA. And just some follow-up in what we're seeing from an NGO side and environmental groups. You can see the tweet from San Francisco Baykeeper. Everybody on the environmental group side, NGO side, is very pleased with these appointments on the DOJ and EPA. I thought it was interesting. Earth Justice put out a quote, very excited about Merrick Garland. And this one is because, DOJ's Environmental Natural Resource Division is the only organization in this country that files more environmental lawsuits than Earth Justice. I think that's a very good indication of what we'll see from an activist DOJ in terms of targeting companies for environmental violations. The fact that, from a social media aspect and what NGOs and environmental groups are saying is we will see a rapid, heavy volume of environmental enforcement actions through a number of different departments, and even there in sub-departments. So it seems like a lot coming at companies right now, and one of the takeaways is just be prepared for this. Have your systems to be in place to be able to handle this kind of influx. So when you're getting RFIs, you can quickly respond from a record standpoint, that there's not you're not losing sleep over what happens, what's the enforcement priorities, am I going to get caught in the crosshairs? The other thing is, we're still seeing it is citizen lawsuits. We saw this one in end of 2019. Really reverberated in 2020 is plastics, citizen lawsuits, $50 million, largest one ever for Clean Water Act for Formosa in Texas. We anticipate this only to increase. You get this, as you saw on the last slide, social media posts and quotes from NGOs and environmental groups. They're seeing a leadership shift at DOJ and EPA that's only going to push them faster and further on to the private citizen lawsuits. So Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, looking at litigation around that. I anticipate this to continue. Plastics is still a hot issue. I think this $50 million lawsuit is a big one, and I could see much more push in the plastic side, but just across the board on the Clean Water Act side. The other thing to think about and to pay attention to is, as we saw the shift from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, there was less of a priority on next generation compliance tools for enforcement and all. There was that shift when Trump administration came into place and Andrew Wheeler took over. There was a shift from using technology to find all the violators they could to compliance of let's get any significant non-compliance fixed. So I anticipate that to shift back, and we could even see an increase with Biden administration on this next generation compliance and enforcement. A lot of folks are talking about this as an area that will be rolled out, and it ties into these kind of broader data initiatives that you'll see. There's also a lot more studies on non-compliance with environmental laws being way worse than maybe people realize. And we'll talk about it from a data side, is there's just more ability for the public, for investors, for agencies to know that now than there were even last year or the year before, or even 4 years ago. So we'll see a big shift from national compliance initiatives back to national enforcement initiatives. So that's going to change the framework for companies. We're anticipating a big focus on next generation compliance and enforcement at a federal level in terms of getting all the data, analyzing it, and then using it for enforcement actions. And I think there's just a wider recognition non-compliance is common. For most of the folks on this webinar, this can often be a very frustrating thing, is that you're working on jobs, or you're working in jobs that puts a big emphasis on compliance. You take it very seriously, and you see many companies kind of skate by. This is something that's been known for a while. There's more and more studies coming out around this. We anticipate this to put pressure on agencies to do more about it, because there's more public data around, where there is compliance or where there is not compliance. And we'll also anticipate that more and more electronic reporting data initiatives will be written into regulatory language to force that. If you followed the stormwater stuff in our previous webinar on the National Academy of Sciences, like on the industrial stormwater permit, where one of their big calls was more data, more publicly available data. All of that comes out as, eventually that gets into this next generation compliance enforcement, getting all the data in and then using it from an enforcement analytics standpoint. So, we've seen the remote enforcement. We're seeing it at not only for OSHA, but we're also seeing it at an agency level on the environmental side. I anticipate this will continue. You can even see it at federal level. They did remote monitoring throughout the year in 2020. We see, 5,000 offsite compliance monitoring. That's, running 5,000 virtual inspections or compliance activities is giving, at a federal level, EPA enough of a toolkit to start doing it much more efficiently and understand what works, what doesn't. We're seeing this push to digital, work from home, remote collaboration. Enforcement's only going to continue, both from like OSHA, EPA, and then even at a local level. So one of the things that's fueling this is this continued digital data, electronic data initiatives. We identified it in 2020 as one of these big focus areas that has only continued in 2021. It's still one of the major issues that we track and look at as a software company. We really want to make sure our customers, companies, are able to get their data in digitally through mobile apps, online apps, as easily as possible, because on the back end, from a reporting standpoint, from a public visibility standpoint, you want to know where problems are before anybody else does. You want to have that control of your environmental program. So one of the things EPA over the past few years has done is really made it a big priority to make data publicly accessible. As you can see, this is from in the past 6 months or so, launching enforcement compliance dashboards, tracking what companies are doing publicly. This is at federal level, so even though there's a lot of messaging around regulatory rollbacks, one of the things that the Trump administration did at EPA was really push out data, which is great for all of us in understanding what's going on out there, really having visibility into it. For companies, though, if you don't have a really good compliance program, this can be very troubling, especially as it trickles into the enforcement aspects. The other thing is they put out an online guidance document portal. So not only is company level data being put out there, but all guidance, all regulatory plans, reports. I mean, everything has gone digital nowadays, and we're quickly seeing companies getting left behind in this push to digital. You can even see it as like EPA, smart mobile tools, field inspectors. It's the same reason all companies now are getting out their own inspection mobile apps. It's why a lot of folks on our platform are using mobile apps to actually do the inspections. It's just more efficient, and we're seeing that on the regulatory side. So the public data as a priority will only continue in 2021. We anticipate lots more push around this. That's at an agency regulatory level. We're also seeing it in the from investors, SEC, public markets. Upper right is improved disclosure for shareholders. That's from BlackRock. CEO, also SEC, is put out some language around disclosures around this, proposed amendments. We anticipate that under the change in administration, this will only get pushed even more. So as a publicly traded company, anybody on here, we anticipate that there'll be even more visibility into how your environmental and safety programs are doing. So you're getting regulatory pressure to pull all this data out publicly. You're also going to get investor and shareholder pressure to do that. And a lot of investment portfolios and investment managers are taking it into account. So we anticipate more push to get the data out there, maybe some more regulatory changes on the structure of that data, like reporting certain specific compliance issues around violations. Not just on climate change and greenhouse gases, but specifically around compliance programs. So over the next year plus, we anticipate more and more pressure on reporting for investment purposes around environmental and safety data. And then there's just a big push to open up the data. As I said before, we saw this in 2020 as one of the issues. But one of the things under EPA looking at NPDES, reducing the number of significant non-compliance, as this is their handout, their advisory, ensuring timely and accurate compliance data. It's a big focus area for our team and getting like lab data into our system so that you can actually look at it quickly and not just have it sitting in a PDF or in a paper report. But penalties right now, $54,883 per day per violation, so quite extensive from a Clean Water Act side. So one of the takeaways here is just making sure you've got good systems in place to get the data to be able to look at it before it goes public. You want to be able to understand what's going on for your program before the greater public is able to see it. And I showed you this exact same chart early on, looking at the 2020 kind of look back of things we talked about. And the red arrow on the left is where the change in administration from Obama to the Trump administration happened in 2016. And what you want to look at is, it's been pretty significant increase in public accessing environmental data from EPA, as we're seeing like a 5, 6, 7, 8x increase over the years, and even over the past year, much more. I anticipate with the push with open data plus the increase and the change on enforcement, this will only continue to go up. I anticipate you'll see that next gen compliance push out more data. Some of the stuff that even Bush and Clinton had to put into practice around open data carried through on the Obama. I think the Biden administration is going to push this out even faster. The Trump administration really contributed to a huge increase in public data set on the EPA side. As we track the number of data sets available, I think it'll continue to skyrocket as we go forward. And then the final piece is with all this data in the public, that next generation compliance and looking at more and more studies around how to use machine learning, so getting the human aspect out of it, even from an enforcement or a compliance standpoint. And as we're looking at maybe the same number of inspectors, less if they were to get more, but supplementing that with machine learning, there can be giant steps forward from an enforcement side. So from a company standpoint, the takeaway here is really pay attention to what data you're putting out there. Really make sure that you know of any potential gaps in your program before somebody else does, because increased enforcement, increased inspectors, but also supplemented by technology. You don't want to be behind on the technology side from what the enforcement agencies have. And then one of the final things for 2021 is really tracking on a technical side, PFAS. This has been in the news We've seen it from EPA starting to put out action plans around it, looking at it in NPDES permits. I anticipate that we will see this show up in more and more water permits, whether they be drinking water, whether they be wastewater, whether they be stormwater. I think there's, in November 2020, EPA put out a memo around NPDES permitting strategy. There's more analytical methods. I think this will continue to be an issue in 2021. I think more so with Michael Regan taking over as the nominee for EPA, just given his experience in North Carolina. A lot of folks have talked about his understanding of PFAS from his time there. I anticipate this to be a hot issue for at the federal level in 2021. So something on a technical side to pay attention to and really think about is what's your exposure risk via your stormwater and industrial wastewater permits. I think there's probably more of a concern on wastewater side, especially if maybe it's not getting routed to some sort of wastewater treatment system. If there's older permits, exemptions, just something to pay attention to as this shifts, because this can quickly become not only a regulatory hot issue, but a public issue with a lot of messaging around PFAS out there and kind of forever chemicals. So this is one of the technical items. A lot more to go into here. We had a little bit at our conference back in the fall on this, but even playing out beyond the water side, but looking at it, PFAS and compost. What happens when you're breaking down compost, or how do you handle it from a trash side? We want to recycle organics, but what does that happen from a PFAS standpoint? And are there liabilities associated with for companies that are running composting operations? I think this one quickly becomes an issue that touches all industries, but even some of those like on the recycling or composting side, that we have a beneficial reuse of those materials, but now you're potentially looking at kind of downstream issues because of the inputs into those systems. So in summary, and we're gonna have time for some questions. I see some coming in already. And a quick reminder to submit them so we can queue them up. But some of the things we're tracking in 2021, really looking at COVID impact. COVID impact from an enforcement side around general duty clause, record keeping, making sure you're keeping your employees safe, having those plans and documentation, but also changing the way that we run EHS programs. We've gone work from home, digital collaboration tools, all of that. COVID has really accelerated that, and we're seeing that as kind of the most forward-thinking companies are adopting EHS software systems to keep up with that and be able to see inspections and work remotely. I think at a federal level, EPA and DOJ leadership will really drive rapid changes. We'll see big enforcement in 2021 as a trickle-down effect of that. And then I think on the technical side, PFAS will be one of the emerging issues for 2021 to really focus on, especially for those in the manufacturing transportation side. I think you'll start seeing this come up more and more frequently. So what's next, or what can you do? I think one of the big things we've talked a lot about in 2020, and as we go into 2021, it'll continue, is resiliency. As I kick this off, how do you build resilient systems? It's a big mission of ours, is to make compliance easy. One of the ways that we can make it easy is having that resiliency. So if you have people out sick, personnel changeover, regulatory change, no matter what, you can still run an EHS program. I think one of the things that we saw is in the past, paper worked. We saw paper really get hit hard with COVID, and the ability for, say, an EHS manager that's managing 15 locations, you just lose all your data almost overnight because you have to work from home. You're worried about contamination risk, cross-contamination across plants. Some people have to space out site visits 3 to 5 days. Paper is quickly becoming obsolete, and we're seeing this big push to digital. As we saw, regulations were easy. If we look at it like 5-10 years, we're easy enough for somebody that's maybe not an environmental person to comply with. We need a better system for that going forward. And then, minimal oversight is oversight and enforcement has only increased. It has never gone backwards. We never see less of it, really, when you look at it from the whole picture of local, state, federal, and private environmental groups, NGOs. So today, I mean, we really focus on this a lot, speed, complexity, consequences of compliance. As we look at 2021, I think the speed thing should not be underestimated. With COVID, we need to be more connected. That often means digitally. The complexity, PFAS is going to be a very complex issue as we look forward. How do you deal with it? Who's really responsible? What are some of the technical ramifications? And then the consequences. We anticipate 2021 to have pretty big financial consequences. I'm really curious to see what it looks like coming, a year from now when we look at the violations by EPA and the monetary penalties paid out. It would not surprise me we see a double or triple of that over the next year. So how are companies dealing with it? A lot of folks on this webinar are customers, in adopting software to minimize disruptions to business. I think it's one of the most efficient ways to operate EHS programs, that also, for the same way you see regulatory agencies using technology to supplement their inspectors, some of the most resilient and innovative companies are using technology to supplement their EHS staffs and operations personnel, cutting costs on not having to go to outside consultants necessarily, but internalizing more operations, making EHS staff more valuable. We can use technology to do a lot of that, whether it be running programs for keeping records digitally, mobile apps, feeding into analytics. But all of that, the goal is to make in-house EHS teams stronger. So one of the things I want to talk about in terms of thinking about 2021 is really look at what your KPIs are, or key performance indicators, or your metrics. Is it to capture inspection data? Is it to digitize all your records? One of the things that we see a lot more focus on, and I think this is getting more awareness at an operational level, is we're seeing more operations people coming over to the EHS department saying, what are our metrics around environmental? And for an EHS professional, being able to not only capture it, but actually have it in one place, whether you work from home or elsewhere, and then being able to share that data internally. And it's a big priority for us. Two things coming out from the Mapistry software side. Later this week, we're releasing a whole new mobile app to get that first part, the field data capture, and make it even more efficient than it is today. But then we'll see in the next 3 to 4 months of releasing an updated version of the analytics. So two of these big areas, field data capture, analytics, are high priorities for us as a company in serving our customers and serving all of you in 2021. And that's really a reflection of these trends that we're seeing, where we want to make sure that we're constantly innovating for our customers so that they can capture that data, analyze it before it's out there on public, before they get an enforcement action. So at this time, we'll open it up to questions. So one of the questions is around PFAS, and are regulatory agencies requiring PFAS analysis in stormwater samples? And the answer is sometimes. We have seen companies be required either through monitoring agreements or consent decrees or administrative orders, be required to analyze for it in stormwater. There's also, under the most stormwater permit provisions, there's a duty to, analyze all your activities and materials and monitor for anything that might be running off from that. So under that clause, we've seen more and more maybe push to say you should at least evaluate the potential for PFAS in your materials or your activities. Is it a chemical that needs to be monitored for? Unfortunately, that leaves it for a very gray area. I think we'll get more certainty over the next year or two as to whether or not you have to require for PFAS, depending on your industry. But we have seen some of it happening already. One question is on COVID, specifically around Cal OSHA and California companies. For company provided testing, I unfortunately do not have any info on that. I can try to point you to some resources, but unfortunately I'm not as much an expert on OSHA and much stronger on the environmental compliance side. But I know from a Cal OSHA regulatory update on COVID, there's been a bunch of new regulations out there, and there's still, for companies across the state, a lot of uncertainty of what they need to do, when they need to do it, and what the ramifications are for it. Follow-up question on the PFAS in industrial or multi-sector general permits or wastewater plant permits. I'm seeing and hearing that it is likely to be in both. I anticipate that we'll see PFAS in both of those types of permits, or even in combined type permits, where it's both combined stormwater process water permit. So it's one of the reasons why I put it on here, and just judging from the questions coming in, is it's a hot issue, and it's only going to get hotter in terms of the amount of focus and the potential regulatory ramifications on it. And this is something from a PFAS standpoint, and I know there's a lot of technical people on this webinar. I did a presentation on the Recycling Institute around stormwater, and this was one of the questions that came up, about a year and a half, even 2 years ago. And at that time, it was like, well, we're thinking about it as an industry, looking at it, making sure we're ahead on it. And there wasn't as much certainty. Now with EPA putting out a formal, an action plan, we're seeing it, more agencies jump in. It's a very sharp jump over the past couple of years as making this a hot issue. I anticipate it really speeds up over the next year or two. All right, one of the other questions that we've got is around kind of like EPA leadership, and what are there going to be their priorities coming in. Everything I have seen goes back to changing it from compliance to enforcement, and then really making a statement around enforcement. Those are the two big things that I'm hearing of what will happen possibly within the first month of the administration change. I think there's a lot of pressure to make a big push right out of the gate. I think it's one of the top issues. You'll see it on climate change and greenhouse gases and clean air stuff. But I think there'll be a big push on the compliance side, and it's one of the things that I've been kind of warning companies around, is just be prepared for that punch when it comes. I anticipate very early on that there'll be a lot of compliance initiatives, a big outreach for requests for information, documents, inspection records, even some of the basics around, like, send us the last 3 to 5 years of all your SPCC inspections, or your last stormwater inspections, or your last air, baghouse inspections, method 22s, whatever it may be. I can see a big push coming right out of the gate, even just gathering that data, and then a follow-up of splashy enforcement actions, announcing that they're prosecuting X, Y, and Z company for certain things. I think there'll be a very big push out of DOJ and EPA in the first 100 days of a Biden administration. All right, I don't see any more questions coming in, so we'll wrap up. Oh, one question coming in from a software side. Does Mapistry have a way to separate environmental punch list items, like checklist, that can separate from like an inspection follow-up item, that might be regulatory driven, versus, more an ad hoc item? Walking around a site, I found something that needs to be fixed, but it's not tied to a compliance issue. And the question is, from a software side, can we separate those out? And yeah, that is one thing you can do, and actually do even better with the launch of our mobile app later this week. There will be a way to create like ad hoc tasks, and then tasks or corrective actions tied to specific checklists or inspection items. So you'll be able to handle both of those, and even be able to run analytics separately. on those type of issues in terms of like maybe I assign my corrective action items to my environmental personnel, but these ad hoc might be to like maintenance or operations as like a reminder to do it. So there is a way in the software to do that. And then there'll even be some new features where you can create subtasks. So one of the things like on the non-environmental compliance side, like SBCC monthly inspection, you may want to fix something immediately. But also on an ad hoc side, you may be going around and you notice sediment basins, starting to fill up with sediment. Well, there might be a series of subtasks in order to fix that, remove the sediment from the basin that you need to do. It's not necessarily tied exactly to a specific regulatory requirement or an inspection checklist that you're doing today, but it's something to the greater permit or plan you have. So you'll be able to create a series of subtasks tied to that. So it could be identify your contractor, get them under contract, pull out the sediment, profile the sediment for disposal, those type of things. So in the software, there is a way not only to separate them out, but even further delineate the subtasks tied to one major task. All right, well, we'll wrap up. We'll send out recording and slides. I appreciate everybody for joining us this morning and hearing about what we're looking at for 2021. And obviously reach out if you have any questions, either on some of the topics we talked about, or if you're interested in finding out more about how to use our software platform for staying ahead of some of these emerging issues.